The morning started like any other Tuesday in September. I arrived at the office at 7:45 a.m., 15 minutes before my usual start time, clutching my oversized coffee and mentally preparing for another day of spreadsheets and client reports. Our department occupied the entire 14th floor of the glass tower on Pine Street, with panoramic views of the Willamette River that never failed to impress visiting clients. The familiar hum of fluorescent lights and the distant sound of keyboards clicking created the soundtrack I'd grown accustomed to over the years. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from, and if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. As I walked past the reception area toward my cubicle, I noticed our department manager, Rebecca Martinez, standing near the break room with someone I'd never seen before. Rebecca was in her mid-30s, always impeccably dressed in tailored suits that made her look like she'd stepped out of a business magazine. She had this way of commanding attention without raising her voice, and in the 4 years I'd worked under her, I'd learned to read her moods by the way she held her shoulders and the speed of her speech. Today, her posture was relaxed in a way I rarely witnessed during work hours. She was laughing, actually laughing at something the stranger was saying. The woman she was talking to appeared to be around the same age, with shoulder-length auburn hair and wearing a navy blue dress that looked expensive but understated. There was something about their body language that suggested familiarity, the kind of easy comfort that develops between people who've known each other for years. I settled into my workspace, which consisted of a corner cubicle with enough space for 2 monitors, a filing cabinet, and a small plant that somehow managed to survive despite my inconsistent watering schedule. From my vantage point, I could observe the entire department floor without being obvious about it. It was a skill I'd developed over years of office politics and workplace dynamics. Sometimes knowing what was happening around you was just as important as excelling at your actual job responsibilities. Around 9:30 a.m., Rebecca gathered our team for what she called an impromptu meeting. Our department consisted of 8 people, 3 senior analysts including myself, 2 junior analysts, 1 data specialist, 1 administrative coordinator, and Rebecca as our manager. We assembled in the small conference room adjacent to Rebecca's office, a space barely large enough for our oval table and the whiteboard that dominated one wall. "Everyone, I'd like you to meet Jessica Thompson," Rebecca announced, gesturing toward the woman I'd seen her talking with earlier. "She'll be joining our team as a senior financial analyst, effective immediately." The silence that followed lasted perhaps 3 seconds, but it felt much longer. In our department, hiring decisions typically involved weeks of interviews, background checks, and consultations with senior positions required approval from the regional director, and often included presentations to multiple stakeholders. The fact that none of us had heard anything about a new hire was unusual, to say the least. Jessica stepped forward with a confident smile. "I'm excited to be working with all of you. I have 8 years of experience in financial analysis, most recently with Camden Associates in Seattle. I'm looking forward to contributing to the team's success." Her introduction was polished and professional, hitting all the right notes, but I noticed something interesting. When she mentioned Camden Associates, her eyes flickered toward Rebecca for just a fraction of a second. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but I caught. After years of analyzing data and looking for patterns, you develop an eye for details that others might miss. The rest of the meeting proceeded with the usual introductions and overview of current projects. Rebecca assigned Jessica to work on the Morrison Industries account, one of our mid-tier clients that required detailed quarterly analysis. It was a substantial assignment for someone's first day, suggesting either remarkable confidence in her abilities or perhaps some prior knowledge of her work quality. As we filed out of the conference room, I overheard Jessica mention to Rebecca that she'd already found an apartment in the Pearl District. The Pearl District was one of Portland's most expensive neighborhoods, not typically the first choice for someone relocating for a new job, unless they had significant savings or were earning considerably more than our standard salary range. Over the next few days, I observed Jessica settling into her role with remarkable ease. She navigated our computer systems like someone who'd been using them for months rather than days. She knew exactly which forms to submit for expense reports, understood our departmental protocols without extensive explanation, and seemed to anticipate Rebecca's preferences for report formatting and presentation style. What struck me most was how comfortable she and Rebecca appeared together. During lunch breaks, they often disappeared together, claiming they were discussing ongoing projects. Their conversations had an easy flow that suggested shared history beyond recent professional interaction. They had inside jokes, finished each other's sentences occasionally, and displayed the kind of synchronicity that typically develops over years of working together. But here's where things became interesting from my perspective. I have an unusual hobby that most of my colleagues don't know about. For the past 6 years, I've been researching genealogy and family histories as a way to unwind after work. What started as curiosity about my own family tree expanded into a broader interest in researching backgrounds, tracing connections, and understanding how people's histories intersect in unexpected ways. I'm not talking about stalking or inappropriate investigation. I'm talking about the kind of public record research that anyone can do with patience and the right resources. Birth certificates, marriage records, property ownership, professional licenses, court documents that are part of the public record. It's all there if you know where to look and have the time to piece together the puzzle. The weekend after Jessica's first week, I found myself wondering about her background. Something about her hiring felt unusual enough to pique my curiosity. I started with basic searches: LinkedIn profiles, professional associations, company website. Jessica's LinkedIn showed her employment history exactly as she'd described: 8 years in financial analysis, with her most recent position at Camden Associates in Seattle. But when I dug deeper into Camden Associates, I discovered something interesting. The company had been acquired by a larger firm 18 months ago, and according to industry publications, several employees had been laid off during the restructure. Jessica's LinkedIn profile showed her employment there ending exactly when the acquisition was completed, which aligned with the timeline of potential layoffs rather than voluntary departure. This detail by itself wasn't particularly significant. Corporate restructuring and layoffs are common in our industry, but it made me curious about other aspects of her background, especially given how quickly she'd been hired and how comfortable she seemed with Rebecca. I spent Saturday afternoon at the Multnomah County Library, using their research databases to look into public records. What I found was routine at first. Jessica Thompson, age 34, previously lived in Seattle, Washington before moving to Portland. She had no criminal record, owned property in Seattle until recently, and had a clean financial history based on available public information. But then I decided to search further back, looking at older records and cross-referencing different databases. This is where my genealogy research skills proved useful. I'd learned how to trace people through various name changes, address histories, and family connections that might not be immediately obvious. That's when I found a marriage certificate from 2008 in King County, Washington. Jessica Marie Thompson, then Jessica Marie Sullivan, had married someone named David Thompson. The marriage had ended in divorce 3 years later, which explained the name change. This information was completely routine and unremarkable. What caught my attention, however, was an address listed on the marriage certificate. The apartment complex where Jessica had lived in 2008 was the same complex where, according to a different set of records, Rebecca Martinez had lived during her college years at the University of Washington. Coincidences happen, especially in cities where young professionals tend to gravitate toward similar neighborhoods and housing options. But this particular coincidence made me curious enough to dig deeper into their potential shared history. I spent Sunday morning researching Rebecca's background, something I'd never thought to do in 4 years of working under her management. Rebecca had graduated from the University of Washington in 2009 with a degree in business administration. According to alumni records and social media posts from that time period, she'd been involved in several student organizations and had worked part-time at a local restaurant near campus. Cross-referencing the timeline, Rebecca would have been living in that apartment complex during the same period when Jessica was married and using the same address. They would have been neighbors, and given their similar ages and career interests, it was entirely possible they'd known each other during that time. But here's where the story takes an unexpected turn and where my research skills uncovered something that would change everything I thought I knew about Jessica Thompson and her relationship with our manager. While searching through University of Washington alumni databases and cross-referencing social media accounts from that time period, I discovered something that made me sit back in my chair and question everything I'd observed over the past week. In a group photo from a 2008 University Business Club event, I found both Rebecca and Jessica, but Jessica wasn't going by the name Jessica Thompson or even Jessica Sullivan at the time. She was listed in the photo caption as Jessica Marie David. This meant she'd been married twice, or there was another name change I hadn't accounted for in my initial research. Either scenario suggested a more complex personal history than what she'd presented during her introduction to our team. More importantly, it confirmed that she and Rebecca had definitely known each other years before Jessica's recent hiring, and they'd chosen not to disclose this connection to anyone in our department. The implications of this discovery were significant. Company policy clearly states that personal relationships must be disclosed when they might impact hiring decisions or workplace dynamics. The fact that Rebecca had hired someone she'd known for over a decade without mentioning their prior relationship raised serious questions about the legitimacy of the hiring process and whether other qualified candidates had been fairly considered. But my research had uncovered something else. Something that made the situation far more complicated than a simple case of undisclosed friendship influencing a hiring decision. As I continued digging through public records, trying to understand Jessica's multiple name changes and her connection to Rebecca, I found a series of documents that revealed a secret from Jessica's past, something that Rebecca clearly didn't know about despite their long history. In 2012, 3 years after Rebecca had graduated and moved to Portland, Jessica had been involved in a legal situation that resulted in sealed court records. While I couldn't access the sealed documents themselves, the case numbers and filing dates were part of the public record, along with the names of the attorneys involved and the general nature of the proceedings. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now back to where we left off. The attorney who had represented Jessica specialized in employment law and whistleblower protection cases. The timing coincided with Jessica's departure from her first job, after college, and the sealed nature of the records suggested either a settlement agreement or a case involving sensitive corporate information. This discovery changed everything. Not only had Rebecca hired someone she'd known for years without disclosing their relationship, but she'd hired someone with a potentially problematic legal history that she was apparently unaware of. The sealed court record suggested that Jessica had been involved in some kind of workplace dispute serious enough to require legal representation and confidential resolution. As I sat in the library that Sunday afternoon, staring at printouts of public records and trying to piece together the full picture, I realized I was holding information that could significantly impact our department and potentially Rebecca's career. The question was, what should I do with it? The ethical implications were complex. On one hand, I'd discovered this information through legitimate research of public records. Nothing I'd done was inappropriate or illegal. On the other hand, using this information in any way felt like crossing a line from a curious colleague into something more intrusive. But there was another consideration. If Jessica's sealed legal history involved issues that could affect our company or our clients, didn't I have an obligation to ensure that information was available to the people making decisions about her employment and access to sensitive financial data? As I drove home that evening, my mind raced through various scenarios and potential consequences. I thought about Rebecca, who had always been a fair and competent manager, and how this situation might affect her standing within the company. I thought about Jessica, who seemed capable and professional despite the secrets in her background. I thought about our team and the potential disruption that could result from exposing these hidden connections and past legal issues. Most of all, I thought about the uncomfortable position I now found myself in, knowing secrets that others didn't, holding information that could change everything, and trying to decide whether my responsibility was to remain silent or to act on what I'd discovered. The following Monday morning, as I watched Rebecca and Jessica interact with the easy familiarity I now understood had developed over years of prior acquaintance, I realized that the comfortable dynamic of our department had permanently shifted. Whether they knew it or not, their secret was no longer safe, and the information I'd uncovered about Jessica's past would eventually demand a decision about what to do next. The question was no longer whether I should investigate further. I'd already learned more than enough to understand the complexity of the situation. The question was whether I could continue to work alongside them, pretending I didn't know what I knew, or whether the weight of these secrets would ultimately force me to take action that could change all of our lives. The next 2 weeks passed in a strange fog of normalcy punctuated by moments of acute awareness. Every interaction between Rebecca and Jessica took on new meaning now that I understood their hidden history. They'd developed an impressive ability to maintain professional boundaries in front of the rest of the team, but small gestures gave them away to anyone paying close attention. During team meetings, Jessica would anticipate Rebecca's questions before they were fully formed. When Rebecca mentioned needing specific data formatted in a particular way, Jessica would nod knowingly and deliver exactly what was expected without requiring clarification. Their communication had an efficiency that typically develops only through extensive collaboration or, as I now suspected, years of personal friendship. The Morrison Industries account that Jessica had been assigned was progressing smoothly, perhaps too smoothly for someone supposedly unfamiliar with our client base and internal procedure. She'd identified cost-saving opportunities that had eluded our previous analyst, and had developed client rapport that normally took months to establish. Either she was exceptionally gifted at financial analysis, or she had access to insights that weren't readily apparent from the standard client files. My curiosity about Jessica's sealed legal records continued to gnaw at me. The attorney who had represented her, Marcus Brennan, specialized in employment disputes involving financial services companies. His law firm's website listed several high-profile cases involving whistleblower protection, securities violations, and corporate fraud. Whatever legal situation Jessica had been involved in during 2012 was serious enough to require representation from one of Seattle's most expensive employment law specialists. I decided to expand my research beyond public record. Using professional networking databases and industry publications, I began investigating Jessica's employment history more thoroughly. Her LinkedIn profile showed a gap between her college graduation in 2010 and her first listed position. That 3-year period coincided exactly with the timeframe of her sealed legal case. The company where Jessica had worked during that missing period was called Northwest Financial Group, a mid-sized investment firm that had been acquired by a larger corporation. According to Industry News Archives, Northwest Financial had been investigated by the Securities and Exchange Commission for questionable trading practices, and the investigation had resulted in substantial fines and the termination of several employees, though specific details about individual cases were not publicly available. This discovery sent chills through me. If Jessica had been involved in securities violations or financial misconduct, her current position at Meridian Financial Solutions could represent a significant compliance risk. Companies in our industry are required to conduct thorough background checks and disclose any employees with regulatory violations to our oversight bodies. I spent my lunch break that Wednesday walking along the waterfront, trying to process the implications of what I'd uncovered. The Columbia River stretched endlessly toward the horizon, and the familiar sight of Mount Hood in the distance usually helped clear my mind. But today, the peaceful scenery couldn't distract me from the growing weight of responsibility I felt. If Jessica had been terminated from Northwest Financial Group as part of the SE investigation, and if that termination was connected to her sealed legal case, then Rebecca had unknowingly hired someone with a history of regulatory violation. The fact that this information wasn't disclosed during the hiring process suggested either incomplete background screening or deliberate concealment. But there was another possibility that I hadn't fully considered. What if Rebecca knew about Jessica's past but had chosen to hire her anyway? What if their friendship was strong enough that Rebecca was willing to overlook potential compliance issues to help Jessica restart her career? This scenario raised even more serious questions about Rebecca's judgment and integrity. As a department manager, she had fiduciary responsibilities to our company and our clients. Knowingly hiring someone with undisclosed regulatory violations could result in her termination and potentially criminal charges if client funds were compromised. I realized I needed more concrete information before drawing any conclusions. The sealed court records were inaccessible, but there might be other sources of information about Jessica's departure from Northwest Financial Group. Industry publications sometimes reported on significant personnel changes, especially when they were connected to regulatory investigation. That evening, I visited the downtown branch of the Portland Public Library, which maintained extensive databases of business publications and legal resources. After 2 hours of searching through financial industry journals and news archives a brief article in Securities Industry News mentioned that Northwest Financial Group had reached a settlement agreement with the SEC regarding improper client fund management. The article noted that 3 employees had been terminated as part of the settlement, though their names were not disclosed. The settlement amount was $2.3 million, suggesting the violations were substantial. More importantly, the article mentioned that one of the terminated employees had filed a wrongful termination lawsuit, claiming they had attempted to report the violations internally before the SEC investigation began. The lawsuit had been settled out of court with confidential terms, which explained the sealed records I'd discovered in Jessica's background. The pieces were starting to fit together. Jessica had likely been a whistleblower who tried to report securities violations at her previous company. When the company was investigated and fined, she was terminated along with other employees, possibly as retaliation for her reporting. Her lawsuit against the company for wrongful termination had been settled confidentially, which explained both the sealed court records and the gap in her employment history. If this interpretation was correct, then Jessica wasn't someone with a history of regulatory violations. She was someone who had tried to prevent regulatory violations and had suffered professionally as a result. The sealed legal records weren't evidence of misconduct. They were evidence of integrity that had cost her career opportunities. This revelation completely changed my understanding of the situation. Instead of being concerned about Jessica's potential compliance risks, I should have been impressed by her ethical courage. Whistleblowing in the financial services industry requires enormous personal sacrifice, and the fact that she'd been able to rebuild her career after such a setback was actually admirable. But this new understanding raised different questions about Rebecca's hiring decision. If Rebecca knew about Jessica's whistleblower history, then her decision to hire her made sense from both personal and professional perspectives. Jessica had demonstrated integrity under pressure, and had the experience to identify potential compliance issues before they became serious problems. However, if Rebecca didn't know about Jessica's past, then she had unknowingly hired someone whose background included sealed legal proceedings and a gap in employment history that could raise questions during regulatory audits. Even if Jessica's actions had been ethically justified, the lack of disclosure could still create compliance problems for our company. I decided I needed to understand more about Rebecca's knowledge of the situation. The following day, I paid closer attention to their interactions, looking for any signs that Rebecca was aware of Jessica's legal history. During a team meeting about regulatory compliance updates, I watched Jessica's reaction when Rebecca discussed new SEC reporting requirements. Jessica's expression remained neutral and professional, but I noticed her hands tense slightly when Rebecca mentioned penalties for non-disclosure of employee background issues. After the meeting, I lingered in the conference room pretending to organize my notes while Rebecca and Jessica discussed project timeline. Their conversation was routine and work-focused, but when Jessica mentioned needing to update her professional certifications, Rebecca's response was telling. "Don't worry about the timeline," Rebecca said. "I know the industry can be complicated when you're getting back on track after career transitions." The pause before career transitions was subtle but significant. It suggested Rebecca knew something about Jessica's employment gap, though whether she understood the full circumstances remained unclear. That weekend, I made a decision that would fundamentally change my relationship with both of them. I decided to approach Jessica directly and let her know what I'd discovered about her background. My reasoning was straightforward. If she was aware that someone else knew about her sealed legal records, she could make informed decisions about disclosure and career protection. I crafted a careful email requesting a private meeting to discuss a sensitive matter related to industry experience and regulatory compliance. I kept the language professional and non-threatening, emphasizing that I had information that might be relevant to her current position but that I wanted to discuss privately before taking any action. Jessica responded within an hour, agreeing to meet for coffee on Saturday morning at a neutral location downtown. Her quick response suggested she might have been expecting something like this. Perhaps she'd noticed my increased attention to her work, or had her own concerns about potential background issues. We met at a small cafe in the Pearl District, not far from the apartment building where Jessica had mentioned living. The space was busy enough to provide privacy through ambient noise, but quiet enough for serious conversation. Jessica arrived precisely on time, dressed casually but professionally, and her demeanor was alert and slightly guarded. "Thank you for agreeing to meet," I began after we'd ordered coffee. "I want to be direct about why I asked you here. I have a hobby of researching genealogy and public records, and while looking into professional backgrounds, which I know sounds intrusive, I discovered some information about your employment history that I think you should know someone else is aware of." Jessica's expression remained carefully neutral, but I saw her shoulders tense slightly. "What kind of information?" "I found records indicating you were involved in legal proceedings in 2012 connected to your employment at Northwest Financial Group. The records are sealed, but the timeline coincides with the SEC investigation of that company. I also found evidence that you filed a wrongful termination lawsuit that was settled confidentially." She was quiet for a long moment, stirring her coffee methodically while considering her response. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady but tinged with resignation. "How much do you know about what actually happened?" "Based on my research, I believe you were a whistleblower who tried to report compliance violations internally. When the company was investigated and fined, you were terminated, possibly in retaliation. You sued for wrongful termination and reached a confidential settlement. The sealed records suggest you were protected under whistleblower statute. I discovered that senior management was using client funds for unauthorized trading to cover losses in the company's proprietary accounts. When I reported it through internal channels, nothing happened. When I persisted, I was told to focus on my assigned responsibility. 3 months later, the SEC began their investigation based on a complaint I filed directly with them." She paused, her eyes focused on something beyond the cafe windows. "The company terminated me along with 2 other employees, claiming we were part of the problem. In reality, we were the only ones who had tried to stop it. The lawsuit took 2 years to resolve, and by then, my reputation in the industry was damaged by association with the scandal." "Does Rebecca know about this history?" "She knows I had employment difficulties after college, and that there was a legal situation I couldn't discuss in detail. She doesn't know the specifics about the whistleblowing or the SEC investigation. When she offered me this position, I disclosed that there were sealed legal records in my background, but I couldn't provide details due to confidentiality agreements." This revelation added another layer of complexity to the situation. Rebecca had hired Jessica knowing there were undisclosed legal issues in her background, which suggested either remarkable trust in their friendship or concerning disregard for proper hiring procedures. "How long have you and Rebecca been friends?" I asked. Jessica smiled for the first time since we'd sat down. "We were roommates during our senior year at University of Washington. She's the one who encouraged me to pursue financial analysis in the first place. When I was going through the legal situation with Northwest Financial, she was one of the few people who stood by me without asking for details I couldn't provide. And she offered you this job without going through normal hiring procedures. She created the position specifically for me. Meridian Financial was planning to expand the department anyway, and when she learned I was available, she convinced upper management to accelerate the timeline. Everything was done properly in terms of approvals and budgets, but yes, I was the only candidate interviewed." The conversation continued for another hour, during which Jessica provided more context about her career rebuild and her friendship with Rebecca. She'd spent 3 years working for smaller firms that were willing to overlook her employment gap, gradually rebuilding her professional reputation. Rebecca's job offer represented the first opportunity she'd had to return to a major financial services company. As we prepared to leave, Jessica asked the question I'd been expecting: "What do you plan to do with this information?" "I honestly don't know yet. I wanted you to be aware that someone else knew about your background so you could make informed decisions about disclosure. I'm not interested in causing problems for you or Rebecca, but I also have to consider whether there are compliance issues that need to be addressed. I understand your position. I've been in situations where doing the right thing comes with personal costs. Whatever you decide, I appreciate you approaching me directly rather than going to management without giving me a chance to explain." As I walked home that afternoon, I realized the situation had become far more complicated than I'd initially understood. Jessica wasn't someone with a questionable past. She was someone who had sacrificed her career to prevent financial misconduct. Rebecca wasn't just helping a friend, she was giving a second chance to someone who deserved it, but the manner in which Jessica had been hired, the lack of full disclosure about her background and the potential compliance implications, still raised legitimate concern. The question was whether those concerns outweighed the human factors involved in the situation. That evening, as I sat in my apartment reviewing everything I'd learned, I knew I had reached a crossroad. The information I possessed could protect our company from potential regulatory issues, but it could also destroy the careers of two people who appeared to be acting with good intentions if not perfect judgment. The decision I made next would affect not just Jessica and Rebecca, but potentially our entire department, and my own future at Meridian Financial Solutions. The weight of that responsibility felt heavier than any financial analysis I'd ever been asked to complete. Monday morning arrived with an unexpected twist that would accelerate everything I'd been wrestling with over the weekend. As I settled into my cubicle with my usual coffee and bagel, I noticed unusual activity in the executive offices on our floor. People in expensive suits were moving through the hallways with briefcases and tablets, speaking in hushed tones that suggested something significant was happening. Around 10 a.m., our entire department received an urgent email from corporate headquarters. Meridian Financial Solutions had been selected for a comprehensive regulatory audit by the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency. The audit would begin the following week and would include detailed reviews of all hiring practices, employee background checks, and compliance procedures implemented over the past 2 years. My stomach dropped as I read the announcement. The timing couldn't have been worse. Jessica had been hired 3 weeks ago, and if the auditors discovered the irregularities in her hiring process or the undisclosed aspects of her background, both she and Rebecca could face serious consequences. More troubling, my own knowledge of the situation now placed me in an impossible position. Rebecca called an emergency department meeting within an hour of the corporate announcement. As we gathered in the conference room, I could see the stress etched across her face. She'd always been composed under pressure, but this was different. Her hands moved restlessly as she arranged papers on the table, and she kept glancing toward Jessica with an expression I couldn't quite decipher. As you've all seen from the corporate announcement, we're facing a comprehensive regulatory audit, Rebecca began. These audits are routine in our industry, but they require absolute transparency and accuracy in all our documentation and procedure. I need everyone to review their files, ensure all compliance training is current, and be prepared to answer detailed questions about your work processes. She paused, her gaze settling on each team member individually. When her eyes met mine, I felt a jolt of recognition. She knew something was amiss, though I couldn't tell how much she suspected. Jessica, since you're our newest team member, I'll need you to work with HR to ensure all your onboarding documentation is complete and readily accessible. Sometimes the paperwork from recent hires gets misplaced during busy periods. Jessica nodded professionally, but I caught the slight tightening around her eyes. She understood the implications as clearly as I did. After the meeting dispersed, I found myself walking toward the elevator with 2 other senior analysts, David Kim and Maria Santa. They were discussing the audit with the casual concern of employees who had nothing to hide, but their conversation revealed information that made my situation even more complex. Remember what happened to the Chicago office last year, David was saying. 3 people were terminated just for incomplete disclosure forms. The regulators don't care about intent, they only care about compliance documentation. Maria shook her head. That's why I keep copies of everything in my personal file. You never know when some paperwork might go missing or when someone might claim they never received proper disclosure about employment history. Their words hit me like a physical blow. If the Chicago office had terminated employees for incomplete disclosure forms, what would happen when auditors discovered that Jessica had sealed legal records that weren't fully disclosed during her hiring process? Even if her actions at Northwest Financial Group had been ethically justified, the lack of complete transparency could still result in termination for both her and Rebecca. I spent the rest of the day in a state of nervous distraction, barely managing to focus on my assigned task. The Morrison Industries analysis that Jessica was handling sat on my desk for review, and as I examined her work, I was struck by its exceptional quality. She'd identified cost-saving strategies that our previous analyst had missed, and had developed recommendations that could save the client nearly $200,000 annually. This wasn't just competent work, it was the kind of innovative thinking that demonstrated why Rebecca had been so eager to hire her. Jessica's experience with securities violations and regulatory compliance had actually enhanced her ability to identify potential risks and opportunities that others might overlook. But talent and good intentions wouldn't matter if the auditors determined that proper hiring procedures hadn't been followed. The regulatory environment in financial services had become increasingly strict following several high-profile scandals, and companies were expected to demonstrate perfect compliance regardless of circumstances. That evening I made a decision that surprised even me. Instead of going home to agonize over my options, I drove to Rebecca's neighborhood. I'd been to her house once before for a department holiday party, and I remembered the address of her craftsman-style home in the Hawthorne district. I needed to understand exactly how much she knew about Jessica's background before the audit began. Rebecca answered the door in casual clothes, looking surprised but not unwelcoming. "Sarah, is everything all right? It's unusual to see colleagues outside the office, unless someone's having a crisis." "I think we might be," I replied. "Could I come in? There's something important I need to discuss with you about the upcoming audit." Her living room reflected her personality, organized, tasteful, and professional even in its casual comfort. Framed photographs on the mantelpiece showed her with various friends and family members, including several pictures with Jessica from what appeared to be college years and more recent social gatherings. "Those photos answer one of my questions," I said, gesturing toward the mantelpiece. "You and Jessica have been friends for much longer than anyone at work realizes." Rebecca's expression shifted from surprise to caution. What exactly do you know about Jessica's situation?" "I know you've been friends since college. I know she was involved in sealed legal proceedings in 2012 related to her employment at Northwest Financial Group. I know she was likely a whistleblower who tried to report securities violations and was terminated in retaliation. I also know that she was hired without going through standard interview procedures, and that the upcoming audit will likely discover all of this." Rebecca sat down heavily on her couch, her professional composure finally cracking. "How could you possibly know all of that? And more importantly, what do you plan to do with the information?" "I have a hobby of researching public records and genealogy. I started looking into Jessica's background because something about her hiring seemed unusual, and the more I discovered, the more concerned I became about potential compliance issues. But after learning the full story, I'm more concerned about protecting both of you from an audit that could destroy your careers." For the next hour, Rebecca provided her perspective on the situation. She confirmed that she and Jessica had been roommates during their senior year at University of Washington and had maintained their friendship despite Jessica's career difficulties. When Jessica contacted her 6 months ago about potential job opportunities, Rebecca had been shocked to learn about the legal troubles and employment gap. "She couldn't tell me the specific details because of confidentiality agreements, but I knew enough to understand she'd been trying to do the right thing and had been punished for it. When our department expansion was approved, I saw an opportunity to help someone who deserved a second chance." "Did you disclose your personal relationship during the hiring process?" Rebecca's silence answered the question before she spoke. "I should have, but I was concerned that HR would automatically disqualify her application if they knew we were friends. I convinced myself that our friendship wouldn't affect my professional judgment, and that her qualifications spoke for themselves." "What about the background check? Did she disclose the sealed legal record?" "She mentioned there were confidential legal matters in her employment history that she couldn't discuss in detail. I indicated on the hiring forms that there were potential background issues that required further review, but I may have understated the significance of those issues." The full scope of the compliance problems was becoming clear. Rebecca had hired a personal friend without disclosing their relationship, had inadequately documented Jessica's background issues, and had bypassed normal interview procedure. Even though both women had acted with good intentions, the procedural violations were exactly the kind of issues that regulatory audits were designed to identify. "Rebecca, I need you to understand how serious this could be. The Chicago office terminated 3 employees last year just for incomplete disclosure forms. If auditors discover that Jessica has sealed legal records that weren't properly disclosed, and that you hired her without revealing your personal relationship, both of your careers could be over. What do you think I should do? I think you need to get ahead of this situation before the auditors discover it themselves. Voluntary disclosure of compliance issues is usually treated more favorably than discoveries made during the audit process. If you approach HR and corporate compliance now, you might be able to frame this as a procedural oversight rather than intentional misconduct. Rebecca was quiet for several minutes, processing the implications of what I was suggesting. Voluntary disclosure would likely result in disciplinary action for both her and Jessica, but it might prevent the more severe consequences that could result from audit discoveries. There's something else you should know, she finally said. Jessica's work on the Morrison Industries account has been exceptional. She's identified compliance risks that our previous analyst missed, and her recommendations could save them significant money while improving their regulatory standing. If we lose her now, we're not just losing a good employee, we're losing someone whose experience with regulatory violations actually makes her more valuable, not less. This was the heart of the dilemma. Jessica's background, which created compliance risks from a procedural standpoint, also provided practical benefits that enhanced her professional value. Her experience with securities violations and regulatory investigations gave her insights that other analysts lacked. Have you considered that Jessica might be safer if the auditors learned about her whistleblower history directly from her, rather than discovering it as an undisclosed background issue? If Jessica voluntarily disclosed her role as a whistleblower who tried to prevent securities violations, that could actually reflect positively on her character and professional integrity. The problem isn't her past actions, it's the lack of complete transparency about those actions during the hiring process. Rebecca's expression showed she was beginning to understand the distinction. Jessica's sealed legal records weren't evidence of wrongdoing. They were evidence of ethical courage that had been inadequately disclosed during the hiring process. You're suggesting we should reframe her background as an asset rather than a liability. I'm suggesting that honesty about her role as a whistleblower might be received more favorably than discovery of undisclosed sealed legal records. But that decision has to come from Jessica herself, since she's the one who would be revealing confidential information about her past. We talked for another hour about potential strategies and consequences. Rebecca was clearly torn between protecting her friend and protecting her own career, but she was beginning to understand that transparency might offer the best path forward for both of them. As I prepared to leave, Rebecca asked me the question I'd been expecting. Why are you helping us? You could have reported this situation to HR yourself and avoided any personal involvement. Because I've learned enough about both of you to believe you're good people who made procedural mistakes while trying to do the right thing. Jessica sacrificed her career to prevent financial misconduct, and you risked yours to give her a second chance. Those actions deserve consideration, even if the procedures weren't perfect. The next morning brought another surprise that would complicate our situation even further. Jessica was absent from work, which was unusual given her consistent attendance during her first 3 weeks. When Rebecca called to check on her, she learned that Jessica had received a phone call the previous evening from someone claiming to represent the audit team. The caller had asked detailed questions about her employment history, and had specifically mentioned Northwest Financial Group and the 2012 S. Jessica had become suspicious when the caller couldn't provide adequate identification or explain how they had obtained her personal phone number. When Rebecca shared this information with me during our lunch break, we both realized the situation had escalated beyond our control. Either someone else had discovered Jessica's background and was investigating independently, or there were security issues with the audit process itself. We need to bring Jessica in on our discussions. She deserves to know that multiple people are now aware of her background, and she needs to be part of any decisions about disclosure or damage control. Rebecca agreed, and we arranged to meet with Jessica that evening at her apartment in the Pearl District. The conversation that followed would determine not just our individual fates, but the future of our entire department as we prepared for an audit that had already begun investigating our most vulnerable secret. As I drove to Jessica's apartment that evening, I reflected on how a simple curiosity about a new colleague's background had evolved into a complex web of ethical dilemmas, personal relationships, and corporate compliance issues. The decisions we made in the next few days would affect not just our careers, but our understanding of what it means to do the right thing when the rules and the human elements of a situation don't align perfectly. The stakes had never been higher, and time was running out to find a solution that could protect everyone involved while maintaining the integrity that had gotten us into this situation in the first place. Jessica's apartment reflected her careful, methodical personality, minimal furniture arranged with precision, books organized by subject, and a small workspace near the window overlooking the city light. When she opened the door that evening, her usual composed demeanor showed cracks of stress and uncertainty. "I've been expecting this conversation," she said as Rebecca and I settled into her living room. After that phone call yesterday, I realized my past was catching up with me faster than I'd anticipated. Rebecca leaned forward in her chair. "Tell us exactly what the caller said. Every detail could be important." Jessica pulled out a notepad where she'd written down everything she could remember. The call came at 8:30 p.m. A man's voice, professional but not warm. He identified himself as Thomas Mitchell from the Regulatory Compliance Division, but when I asked which agency, he said he was contracted through multiple departments and couldn't specify. She flipped to the next page of her note. He knew about Northwest Financial Group, the 2012 investigation, and my legal settlement, but here's what bothered me. He also knew details that weren't in any public record. He mentioned my former supervisor's name, the specific trading accounts that were involved in the violations, and even the conference room where I first reported the discrepancies to management. My research instincts immediately activated. Those details would only be available to someone who had access to internal company records or sealed court documents. Either this person has legitimate investigative authority, or someone with insider knowledge is feeding them information. "There's more," Jessica continued. "He asked about my current employment and specifically mentioned working with former associates. When I asked what he meant, he said he was aware I was working closely with people from my university years. He didn't mention Rebecca by name, but the implication was clear." Rebecca's face had gone pale. "How could anyone outside our company know about our college connection? We've been careful to maintain professional boundaries at work." "Not careful enough, apparently," I said. "Remember those photographs on your mantelpiece? If someone was investigating Jessica's background and discovered her connection to you, it wouldn't be difficult to find evidence of your friendship through social media, alumni records, or public photographs." Jessica set down her notepad and looked directly at both of us. "I need to know exactly how much each of you knows about my situation, and I need to understand what kind of exposure we're all facing. This mysterious caller has information that suggests someone is conducting a very thorough investigation." Over the next hour, we laid all our cards on the table. I explained my genealogy research and everything I'd discovered about Jessica's background. Rebecca detailed her knowledge of Jessica's employment troubles and her decision to hire her despite incomplete disclosure. Jessica filled in the gaps with details about her whistleblowing experience and the personal cost of her ethical stand. The settlement agreement I signed included confidentiality clauses that prevent me from discussing specific details about Northwest Financial Group's violations. Jessica explained. "But those clauses don't prevent me from acknowledging my role as a whistleblower if I'm questioned by legitimate regulatory authorities. The question is whether this Thomas Mitchell represents legitimate regulatory authority," Rebecca said. "If he's part of the official audit process, then Jessica needs to be prepared for formal questioning. If he's not, then we need to understand who he is and what he wants." I had an idea that might help us determine the caller's legitimacy. "Jessica, did he give you a callback number or any way to reach him?" "He said he'd contact me again when he had additional questions. No callback number, no business card, no official documentation. That's suspicious. Legitimate regulatory investigators always provide contact information and official identification. They're required to give people being questioned the ability to verify their authority and consult with legal counsel." Rebecca was pacing now, her analytical mind working through possibility. "If this person isn't part of the official audit, Then someone else is investigating Jessica's background independently. But why? And what do they hope to accomplish? There's another possibility we haven't considered. What if someone at Meridian Financial Solutions is aware of irregularities in Jessica's hiring and is conducting their own investigation before the official audit begins? The implications of this scenario were troubling. If someone within our own company was investigating Jessica's background, it could mean that concerns about her hiring had already been raised internally. Alternatively, it could mean someone was trying to gather evidence to use against Rebecca or Jessica for personal or political reasons. We need to find out who Thomas Mitchell is, Jessica said firmly. If he calls again, I'm going to demand proper identification and documentation of his authority. If he can't provide it, I'm going to report the contact to our corporate security department. Rebecca nodded in agreement. But we also need to prepare for the possibility that his investigation is legitimate, even if his methods are questionable. The official audit begins Monday, and we need to decide how to handle disclosure before then. I've been thinking about that, I said. There might be a way to turn Jessica's whistleblower background into an advantage rather than a liability. If she voluntarily discloses her experience with regulatory violations and frames it as specialized expertise that benefits our clients, it could actually strengthen her position. Jessica looked skeptical. You're suggesting I should reveal confidential information about my past case? I'm suggesting you should emphasize your experience with compliance issues without violating your confidentiality agreement. You can acknowledge that you've dealt with regulatory investigations and settlements without providing specific details about Northwest Financial Group. That's actually brilliant, Rebecca said, her excitement growing. Jessica's experience with securities violations makes her uniquely qualified to identify similar risks in our clients' portfolios. Instead of hiding her background, we could present it as specialized training that enhances our department's capability. We spent the next 2 hours developing a strategy for voluntary disclosure that would reframe Jessica's background as a professional asset. The key was to emphasize her role as someone who had identified and reported regulatory violations, not someone who had been involved in creating them. Jessica would request a meeting with HR and corporate compliance to discuss her background before the audit began. She would acknowledge that her previous employment had involved regulatory issues that resulted in sealed legal proceedings, and she would emphasize that her experience had given her valuable insights into compliance risk. Rebecca would simultaneously disclose her personal friendship with Jessica and explain that their college relationship had given her confidence in Jessica's integrity and professional capability. She would acknowledge that the friendship should have been disclosed during the hiring process, and accept responsibility for the procedural oversight. My role would be to provide supporting documentation about Jessica's professional qualifications and the value she'd already brought to our department through her work on the Morrison Industries account. As we finalized our strategy, Jessica's phone rang. The caller ID showed an unknown number, and we all tensed as she answered. Jessica Thompson speaking. Miss Thompson, this is Thomas Mitchell. I'm calling to schedule a follow-up conversation about your employment history. Are you available to meet tomorrow evening? Jessica looked at us and nodded, putting the call on speaker. Mr. Mitchell, before we schedule anything, I need you to provide proper identification and documentation of your authority to conduct this investigation. There was a pause before he responded. I understand your concern, Thompson. I represent multiple regulatory agencies in matters involving financial services compliance. The specific details of my authority are confidential, but I can assure you that cooperation with this investigation is in your best interest. I'm sorry, but that's not sufficient, Jessica replied firmly. If you're conducting an official investigation, you need to provide proper identification, contact information, and documentation of your authority. If you can't do that, I'll need to report this contact to my company's security department. Another pause, longer this time. Ms. Thompson, I think you may be misunderstanding the nature of this inquiry. I'm not conducting an official investigation at this time. I'm gathering information for parties who have concerns about your current employment situation. The admission sent chills through all of us. This wasn't a regulatory investigator. This was someone conducting private research on behalf of unnamed clients with concerns about Jessica's employment. Who are these parties, and what are their concerns? Jessica, I'm not at liberty to discuss my clients' identities, but I can tell you that they have information about your previous employment that could be relevant to your current position. If you're willing to discuss your background voluntarily, it might be possible to address their concerns without involving official channels. The threat was barely veiled. Someone was using Jessica's past as leverage, either to force her resignation, or to gather information that could be used against her later. Mr. Mitchell, I'm terminating this conversation. If you or your clients have concerns about my employment, they should address them through proper corporate channels. Any further unauthorized contact will be reported to authorities. Jessica ended the call and immediately began taking notes about the conversation. Well, that clarifies things. This isn't about regulatory compliance. Someone is trying to use my background to force me out of my job. But who would want to do that? Rebecca asked. You've only been here 3 weeks. You haven't had time to make enemies or threaten anyone's position. I had a theory that I didn't want to voice, but the timing and nature of the investigation suggested someone with access to internal information about Jessica's hiring. Rebecca, who else knew about Jessica's hiring before it was announced to the department? Just me, HR, and upper management. The approval process involved our regional director and the vice president of operations. Did anyone express concerns about the hiring during the approval process? Rebecca hesitated before answering. The VP asked some questions about the speed of the hiring and whether we had considered other candidates. I assured him that Jessica was uniquely qualified for the position. What's the VP's name? Robert Chen. He's been with the company for 12 years and has always been supportive of our department. My stomach dropped. Chen was a common surname, but the coincidence was troubling. Rebecca, is Robert Chen related to anyone else in the company? I don't think so. Why? Because my last name is Chen, and if there's a family connection I'm not aware of, it could explain how someone gained access to information about Jessica's background. The possibility that I might be unknowingly related to someone involved in investigating Jessica's background added another layer of complexity to an already complicated situation. I made a mental note to research Robert Chen's family connections as soon as possible. Regardless of who's behind this investigation, we need to accelerate our timeline for voluntary disclosure, Jessica said. If someone is planning to use my background against me, I'd rather control the narrative myself. We agreed to implement our disclosure strategy first thing the following morning. Jessica would request an immediate meeting with HR and corporate compliance. Rebecca would schedule a separate meeting to discuss the procedural oversight in the hiring process, and I would prepare supporting documentation about Jessica's professional contribution. As we prepared to leave Jessica's apartment, she stopped us at the door. I want both of you to know that I appreciate your support, but I don't want either of you to sacrifice your careers for my sake. If this situation becomes untenable, I'm prepared to resign to protect you from further complications. That's not going to happen, Rebecca said firmly. We're going to handle this properly and professionally. Your background is an asset, not a liability, and we're going to make sure everyone understands that. I drove home that night with mixed emotions. We had a plan that might protect all of us from the mysterious investigation, but we were also racing against unknown adversaries who seemed to have access to information and resources that we couldn't map. The next few days would determine whether our strategy of transparency and voluntary disclosure could overcome the threats and manipulations that were designed to destroy Jessica's career and potentially Rebecca's as well. The stakes had never been higher, and the game we were playing had rules that none of us fully understood. As I lay in bed that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were missing something important about Thomas Mitchell's investigation and the parties he represented. Someone with significant resources and inside information was targeting Jessica specifically, and until we understood their motives and methods, we would be fighting a battle without knowing who our real enemies were. Friday morning arrived with an urgency that matched our accelerated timeline. Jessica had scheduled her meeting with HR for 10 a.m., while Rebecca arranged to speak with corporate compliance at 11. I spent the early hours preparing comprehensive documentation about Jessica's professional contributions. including her innovative analysis of the Morrison Industries account and the potential cost savings she'd identified. But before any of our meetings could take place, I received a phone call that would change everything we thought we knew about the situation. Sarah Chen? The voice was unfamiliar but professional. Yes. This is Sarah. My name is Detective Angela Rodriguez with the Portland Police Bureau's Financial Crimes Division. I need to speak with you about an investigation involving your workplace. Can you meet me at the downtown precinct this morning? My heart rate spiked. Am I in some kind of trouble? You're not a suspect, Miss Chen, but you may have information relevant to an ongoing investigation. I'd prefer to discuss this in person rather than over the phone. I called Rebecca immediately after hanging up with Detective Rodriguez. When I explained the situation, there was silence on the other end for several seconds. This can't be a coincidence, she finally said. Someone reported Jessica's background to law enforcement. We need to cancel our meetings with HR until we understand what's happening. I arrived at the police station 30 minutes later, my mind racing through possible scenarios. Detective Rodriguez was a woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. She led me to a small interview room and got straight to the point. Ms. Chen, we received a report this week, alleging that your company has hired someone with undisclosed criminal background issues. The report specifically mentioned Jessica Thompson and provided detailed information about sealed court records from Who filed this report? The information came through an anonymous tip line, but it included documentation that suggests someone with access to confidential legal records was involved. We're investigating whether there's been unauthorized access to sealed court documents. Detective Rodriguez opened a file folder and showed me photocopies of documents I recognized from my own research, marriage certificates, address records, and case filing numbers from Jessica's legal proceeding. But there were also documents I'd never seen, including what appeared to be excerpts from sealed court records that shouldn't have been accessible to the public. Ms. Chen, we know you've been researching Ms. Thompson's background through public record. Can you tell me how you obtained this information and whether you've shared it with anyone else? I spent the next hour explaining my genealogy research hobby and detailing everything I'd discovered about Jessica's background. I emphasized that all my research had been conducted using publicly available records, and that I'd approached Jessica directly when I learned about her whistleblower history. Detective Rodriguez, I need you to understand that Jessica was a whistleblower who tried to prevent securities violations. She wasn't involved in any criminal activity, she was trying to stop it. We understand that, Ms. Chen. That's why we're concerned about who obtained these sealed court records, and why they're trying to use them against her. Someone with significant resources and legal connections is targeting Ms. Thompson specifically. The detective leaned forward, her expression serious. We believe this anonymous report is part of a larger pattern of harassment, designed to damage Ms. Thompson's career prospects. We've seen similar cases where whistleblowers are targeted years later by people who want to discredit their testimony or prevent them from working in positions where they might identify new violations. This revelation completely reframed our understanding of the situation. Jessica wasn't just facing random corporate politics. She was being systematically targeted because of her previous whistleblowing activities. Do you have any suspects? We're investigating several possibilities, including former employees of Northwest Financial Group who might have ongoing litigation concerns related to the 2012 violations. We're also looking at people who might benefit financially from discrediting witnesses to securities fraud. Detective Rodriguez asked me to provide copies of all my research materials and to contact her immediately if I received any suspicious communications. She also warned me that Jessica might be in physical danger if the harassment escalated beyond employment sabotage. I left the police station with a new understanding of the stakes involved. This wasn't about corporate compliance issues or workplace politics. This was about criminals trying to silence a whistleblower who had cost them millions of dollars in fines and settlement. I called Rebecca and Jessica from my car, asking them to meet me immediately at a secure location away from our office. We gathered at a small restaurant in Southeast Portland, choosing a corner booth where we could speak privately. The police think Jessica is being targeted by people connected to the Northwest Financial Group violations. I explained. Someone with access to sealed court records is trying to destroy her career prospects, possibly to prevent her from identifying similar violations at other companies. Jessica's face went pale. I always worried this might happen. When you blow the whistle on securities fraud, you make enemies who have long memories and significant resources. The detective said you might be in physical danger if the harassment escalates. They're treating this as a potential stalking case with criminal intent. Rebecca slammed her hand on the table. This is insane. Jessica did the right thing, and now she's being punished for it years later. We can't let these people destroy her career. Actually, Jessica said, quietly, I think I know who's behind this. She pulled out her phone and showed us a news article from earlier that week. Marcus Webb, the former CEO of Northwest Financial Group, was released from federal prison last month after serving 3 years for securities fraud. His conviction was based partially on my testimony and the evidence I provided to investigators. The article included a recent photograph of Webb leaving the federal courthouse after a hearing related to his asset forfeiture case. He was fighting to recover frozen assets that had been seized as part of his criminal penalty. If Webb is trying to get his assets back, discrediting my testimony could be crucial to his legal strategy. Jessica continued. If he can prove I was unreliable or had ulterior motives for reporting the violations, he might be able to challenge his conviction and asset forfeiture. This explanation made perfect sense. Webb had lost everything because of Jessica's whistleblowing. His company, his fortune, his freedom, and his reputation. Targeting her current employment could be part of a strategy to undermine her credibility in ongoing legal proceedings. So what do we do? Rebecca asked. We stick with our original plan but we modify it. I said. Jessica still needs to disclose her background to corporate compliance, but now we frame it as a security issue rather than just a procedural matter. The company needs to know that she's being targeted by criminals who might try to use her employment against her. Jessica nodded. I should also contact the FBI agents who handled my original case. They need to know that Webb or his associates are attempting witness intimidation. We spent the next hour refining our strategy. Jessica would meet with corporate security and compliance to explain the criminal targeting she was facing. Rebecca would disclose their friendship and emphasize that Jessica's security concerns made her a valuable asset for identifying potential threats to the company. I would provide all my research materials to both corporate security and law enforcement. The meeting with corporate compliance took place that afternoon in a secure conference room with the company's chief security officer present. Jessica presented a comprehensive overview of her whistleblower background, the criminal targeting she was facing, and the potential value her experience provided to Meridian Financial Solutions. The response was better than we had hoped. Instead of viewing Jessica's background as a liability, corporate leadership recognized that her experience with securities fraud made her uniquely qualified to identify similar risks in their client portfolio. Her ability to spot regulatory violations could protect the company from costly compliance failures. More importantly, the security department took the criminal targeting seriously and implemented protective measures for Jessica's employment records and personal information. They also agreed to coordinate with law enforcement to investigate the unauthorized access to her sealed court records. Rebecca's disclosure of their friendship was handled as a minor procedural oversight that required additional documentation but didn't invalidate Jessica's hiring. The fact that Rebecca had chosen to hire someone with proven integrity and specialized compliance experience was viewed favorably by upper management. The official regulatory audit began the following Monday, but our proactive disclosure had eliminated most of the potential problems. Jessica's background was properly documented, her specialized experience was recognized as an asset, and the criminal targeting was being addressed through appropriate security channels. During the audit interviews, Jessica's knowledge of regulatory compliance impressed the audit. Her ability to identify potential violations and recommend preventive measures demonstrated exactly the kind of expertise that regulators wanted to see in financial services companies. The mystery of Thomas Mitchell was solved when Detective Rodriguez called with an update on their investigation. Mitchell was a private investigator hired by Marcus Webb's legal team to gather information that could be used to challenge Webb's conviction. The investigation had identified several former Northwest Financial Group whistleblowers who were being systematically harassed in an attempt to discredit their testimony. Webb was arrested for witness intimidation and violation of his parole term. His assets remained frozen, and his attempts to overturn his conviction were unsuccessful. Jessica would need to testify in new proceedings against Webb, but this time she had the full support of law enforcement and corporate security. 6 months later, our department had been restructured with Jessica promoted to a senior compliance specialist position that utilized her unique expertise. Her work had identified potential violations in 3 client accounts, saving the company from regulatory fines and protecting client assets worth millions of dollars. Rebecca received a commendation for her hiring decision and her handling of the security situation. Her willingness to take a risk on someone with a complex background had ultimately strengthened the department and demonstrated the value of looking beyond conventional credentials. My role in uncovering the situation led to an opportunity to work more closely with corporate security on background research and threat assessment. My genealogy and research skills proved valuable for investigating potential risks to company personnel and operations. The regulatory audit concluded with commendations for our department's compliance procedures and risk management practices. Jessica's presence had elevated our capabilities in ways that wouldn't have been possible with a conventional hire. But perhaps the most important outcome was the personal growth that came from navigating such a complex ethical situation. We had learned that doing the right thing sometimes requires taking risks, that transparency is usually the best policy even when it's difficult, and that supporting people with integrity is worth the potential complication. Jessica's story became a case study within our company about the value of hiring people with diverse backgrounds and lived experience. Her journey from whistleblower to compliance specialist demonstrated that past challenges could become professional strengths when properly understood and supported. The friendship between Jessica and Rebecca, which had initially seemed like a potential conflict of interest, proved to be the foundation for one of the most successful hiring decisions in our department's history. Their trust and understanding allowed Rebecca to see past conventional concerns and recognize talent that others might have overlooked. As for Thomas Mitchell and the harassment campaign against Jessica, the investigation revealed a network of private investigators and corporate security firms that specialized in intimidating whistleblowers and other corporate critics. The case led to new legislation strengthening protections for people who report corporate wrongdoing. Looking back on those intense weeks of discovery, investigation, and resolution, I realized that my initial curiosity about a new colleague's background had uncovered something much more significant than workplace secret. It had revealed the ongoing struggle between corporate accountability and the powerful interests that try to silence those who speak truth to power. Jessica's courage in reporting securities violations had cost her years of career difficulties and ongoing harassment, but it had also prevented millions of dollars in investor losses and helped strengthen regulatory protections for all market participants. Her hiring at Meridian Financial Solutions wasn't just a second chance, it was recognition that integrity and specialized experience are more valuable than conventional credentials. The lesson I learned from this experience is that sometimes the most important information isn't found in official channels or standard procedures. Sometimes it's discovered through careful observation, patient research, and the willingness to ask difficult questions when something doesn't seem right. But the most important lesson was about the power of supporting people who have the courage to do the right thing, even when it comes with personal cost. Jessica's story reminded us that ethical behavior should be rewarded, not punished, and that companies are stronger when they embrace people who have proven their integrity under pressure. Today, our department continues to benefit from Jessica's expertise and Rebecca's leadership. The experience taught us all that workplace secrets often have deeper implications than they initially appear, and that transparency, though sometimes uncomfortable, usually leads to better outcomes for everyone involved. The manager who hired her best friend in secret had ultimately made one of the best decisions of her career, even if the process wasn't perfect. Sometimes the most valuable employees are those whose backgrounds tell stories of courage, integrity, and the willingness to stand up for what's right, regardless of the personal consequences. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now, and hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest upload.